Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I pray you put...
Hello everyone, this is Mr. Pete. We are in our last month of the Wednesday Wars, and we left off in May with Mrs. Baker finding out that her husband was rescued and will be coming home in time for strawberries. We don't know when that is. Mrs. Baker had just finished taking Holling to see all of the amazing architecture around Long Island, from an old Quaker meeting house to two different churches, a temple, and they ended up, of course, at St. Adalbert's, where they lit candles for people that they loved. And of course, Holling, in that month, found his sister and sort of stood up to the father, and it will all come together, I hope, in the month of June. So here we go. A little sad. Mrs. Baker hated camping. You could tell this because her eyes rolled whenever the subject came up, which was plenty lately, since that's what her class was going to do to celebrate the end of the school year. 2 nights of camping up in the Catskill Mountains beside a waterfall in deep woods. On soggy ground, said Mrs. Baker. It'll be great, said Danny. With mosquitoes, said Mrs. Baker. Mosquitoes, said Marilee. Sleeping on rocks, said Mrs. Baker. Terrific, I said. Dew all over us, said Mrs. Baker. Great, said Doug Zwitek. Let's get back to sentence diagramming, said Mrs. Baker. You might wonder why Mrs. Baker was going to take us camping when she thought that camping meant soggy ground, mosquitoes, sleeping on rocks, and dew. But every year since she had first begun to teach at Camillo Junior High, Mrs. Baker had taken her class camping in June. Lieutenant Baker had come along, probably because he loved camping, and Mrs. Baker was willing to put up with soggy ground, mosquitoes, sleeping on rocks, and dew for his sake. Maybe she wanted to go this year because he would have wanted to go. Maybe she thought if she kept every routine the same, then he really would be home in time for strawberries. So Mrs. Baker was taking us camping even though she hated camping. Irony. But let me tell you, Mrs. Baker would have had to hate camping a whole lot more to keep herself from smiling through all of her classes. Even when she was rolling her eyes or crossing her arms or fussing that Mr. Van Larry had still not gotten all the spilled cider mopped up so that it was sticky on the feet when you walked into the coat room. She was still smiling anyway because Lieutenant Baker was coming home. Now compare this version of Mrs. Baker to the version of Mrs. Baker during Christmas, to the version of Mrs. Baker during the testing. This is a different Mrs. Baker. As great a teacher as she is, we didn't see her smiling a whole lot up to this point. It was all in the papers. Even Walter Cronkite talked about it on the 6:30 News. How Lieutenant Baker's helicopter was shot down, how he jumped out before the helicopter hit the ground and shattered, how his leg was caught by one of the broken blades, how he hid in the jungle near Khe Sanh, trying to keep his wound clean and eating chocolate bars from his pack, how he followed a river until he couldn't go any further, how he was found by a woman who already had 2 sons killed and didn't want anyone else to die. So she took him back to her house, how he hid there for 3 months until an American helicopter came over and he signaled, and how the crew pulled him out. It was, said Walter Cronkite, a miraculous rescue. I guess it's like Prospero pulling back the curtain for the king, and there's Prince Ferdinand, who the king thought was dead, playing chess with Miranda like he was on vacation. Or maybe a little like a phone call late at night from your sister, who isn't all that interested in finding herself anymore. She just wants to find you. So Mrs. Baker was smiling because no one can help smiling at miracles. The camping trip was going to be on Thursday and Friday of the 2nd week of June. Everything before that, said Mrs. Baker, would be work. Work like we had never known work. Work that would make us drop. Work that would make us beg for mercy. It was hard to worry too much about this since she was smiling the whole time she said it, but she really did work us like we had never been worked before. Sentence diagramming, short stories by John Steinbeck. Love John Steinbeck. Wrote several of my favorite stories of all time. I'll get to those later. The spelling and construction of adverbs and adjectives with Latinate endings, declining strong verbs, more short stories by John Steinbeck, who wrote a whole lot of short stories, he did, and an essay report on any 3 poems written before 1900, because Mrs. Baker thought that no one had written any poems worth writing about since then. That's not true. Mostly true, but not true. All this in 2 weeks. And that doesn't count Mr. Petrelli's Westward Expansion and You report or Mr. Samowitz's pre-algebra final examination. And it didn't count Much Ado About Nothing, which should have counted for the whole shebang since it advertised itself as a comedy. But let me tell you, it wasn't. Of course it's not always funny, said Mrs. Baker. Why would you imagine that a comedy has to be funny? Mrs. Baker, if it's a comedy, it's supposed to be funny. That's what comedies are. No, Holling, said Mrs. Baker. Comedies are much more than funny. And she smiled again. Whatever it was supposed to be much more than, Much Ado About Nothing wasn't funny. Maybe a line or two here and there, but other than that, pretty much not funny. I mean, talk about jerks. Claudio and Hero. Shakespeare wasn't all that good about his names. Claudio and Hero would have a whole lot to do just to get up where Romeo and Juliet were. First they're in love, then they're not in love, and Hero has to pretend to die. Does this sound familiar? Don't you think Shakespeare needed some new material? And Claudio has to pine away at her tomb, and then Hero has to come back to life, and then they fall in love again just like that. Really? Can you believe this stuff? Because you don't have to be Shakespeare to know that's not the way it happens in the real world. In the real world, people fall out of love, little by little, not all at once. They stop looking at each other. They stop talking. They stop serving lima beans. After Walter Cronkite is finished, one of them goes for a ride in a Ford Mustang, and the other goes upstairs to the bedroom. And there is a lot of quiet in the house, and late at night, the sounds of sadness creep underneath the bedroom doors and along the dark halls. So he's talking about his parents, who clearly are not getting along because of how his dad has acted during his sister's leaving of the house in return. Maybe it's a combination of everything. That's the way it is in the real world. It's not always smiles. Sometimes the real world is like Hamlet, a little scared, unsure, a little angry, wishing that you could fix something that you can't fix, hoping that maybe the something would fix itself, but thinking that hoping that way is stupid. And sometimes the real world is more like Bobby Kennedy, who was a sure bet for the Democratic nomination and probably would have been president of the United States and stopped the war, but who got shot at point blank range. After she heard the news, my sister locked herself in her bedroom. She put on the Beatles singing Eleanor Rigby, an amazingly sad song, but an amazing song. It was my first favorite Beatles song, and played it over and over and over again, low, so that I could just barely hear it through her door. I knocked after something like the 50th repetition. Heather? No answer. The song started over. I knocked again, but she turned up the volume, and the Beatles sang about all the lonely people and wondered where they all came from, as if we didn't know. But I kept knocking until finally the music stopped, and the door jerked open, and it looked for a moment like my sister was going to take my head off, but she didn't. Behind her, the Beatles sang of Father Mackenzie, walking away with the dirt of a grave on his hands. I took Heather's hand, and we left the house together. We walked to St. Adalbert's. We waited on a long line to light 2 candles, and though we both were crying, everyone was crying, we kept holding each other's hands, and we said the same prayer. I love, how their relationship has completely changed over the past year, and I love that he is doing something with her that he learned from Mrs. Baker, paying it forward. But it's not always miracles, as if we didn't know that too. Bobby Kennedy died the next morning.
What has violence ever accomplished? What has it ever created? No martyr's cause has ever been stilled. by an assassin's bullet. No wrongs have ever been righted by riots and civil disorders. A sniper is only a coward, not a hero. And an uncontrolled or uncontrollable mob is only the voice of madness, not the voice of the people. Among free men, said Abraham Lincoln, there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. And those who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. Violence breeds violence. Repression breeds retaliation. And only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. For there is another kind of violence, slower, but just as deadly destructive as the shot or the bomb in the night. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger, and schools without books, and homes without heat in the winter. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. But we can perhaps remember, if only for a time, that those who live with us are our brothers, and surely we can begin to work a little harder to bind up the wounds among us and to become in our hearts brothers and countrymen once again.
We heard it together on the transistor radio, Heather and me. She cried, and I held her, gut crying, not knowing what at all to do except to be together. And if I hadn't heard that Lieutenant Baker was going to come home and that some miracles stand a chance of being real, I think I might have given up on the whole Presbyterian thing right then. Sort of like Julius Caesar giving up on Brutus and going ahead and dying. Early the next Thursday morning, a bus pulled up to take Mrs. Baker's class to the Catskill Mountains. We taunted the other 7th graders going on into their classrooms. Then there was running onto the bus to pick out our seats and a lot of running back out to help load the hot dogs and buns and chili and water bottles and juice powder mix and marshmallows and more marshmallows and the loaves of bread and wool blankets for everyone and extra wool blankets for just in case, and then running onto the bus again to make sure that no one had stolen our seats, and then running out again to go to the bathroom one more time since the only bathrooms where we were going had branches on them. It took Mrs. Baker and Mr. Van Larry and even Mrs. Sidman, who was coming along with us to lend Mrs. Baker moral support, she said, to get us finally herded onto the bus. Then it bumped into gear and we were out onto Lee Avenue. We sang as we drove to the Long Island Expressway. We got to old Miss O'Leary, taking a lantern to her shed, and the flea on the fly, on the hare, on the wart, on the frog, on the bump, on the log, in the hole, in the bottom of the sea, and the bullfrog stubbing his toe and falling in the water. When we reached the Throg's Neck Bridge, Doug Switek started 1,000 bottles of beer on the wall until Mrs. Baker came down the bus aisle and didn't need to say anything. She had her arms crossed. A very ominous vocabulary word. Beginning. After an hour, the bus went from the highway to the thruway, then an hour later, off a sharp exit to a 2-lane road, then to a gravel road, then to a dirt road. Finally, we ended up on a 2-track path that the bus could never have gotten out of if the path didn't double back on itself. When we reached the end of that, and let me tell you, this took a while, we climbed out and Mrs. Sidman tried to keep us corralled together as Mrs. Baker issued a pack to each of us. The pack Mrs. Baker gave Danny was full of cans of chili, which weighed enough to make Danny stop smiling pretty quickly. The pack she gave me held 4 cans of chili. Big cans of chili. And all the utensils. If something happens to this pack, she said, when she hefted it onto my shoulders, we're all going to eat with our fingers. What could happen? I said. Famous last words. That is probably what Hero's father was thinking after the wedding date was set, she said. Which, if you haven't read Much Ado About Nothing lately, was Mrs. Baker's way of saying that a whole lot could happen. In small groups, we followed Mrs. Baker onto a path that went mostly uphill while jutting up as many tree roots as it could to trip us. It wasn't too long before we were all stretched out, a long and straggling line that got longer and stragglier the farther we went. Still, it was a June day to be blithe and bonny in. The leaves up in the hills still had that fresh color they have when they're just a couple of weeks old, and they give off that green smell that mixes so well with sunshine in June. A few big billows of clouds floated ahead of us. We could see them piled up when the maples thinned out to birches, carried on winds that were way too high to reach us below the trees. Top branches rubbed together now and then, their creaking and cracking the only sound we heard, except for the group up ahead that was singing about Napoleon's army of 50,000 men climbing up a hillside. They probably weren't carrying hefty cans of chili. I was the very last person on the path, and let me tell you, after a while that bugged me. It wasn't that I was alone. Mrs. Sidman walked in front of me, picking up sweatshirts and canteens that hadn't been tied to the packs very well, and handing them to Danny and Merrill Lee when her arms got too full. But you put all the utensils for an entire class in one pack, and 4 big cans of chili, and you're carrying quite a bit, and that's going to slow you down. And it was an old pack, and it smelled old. I had to keep hefting it back up around my shoulders because the straps wouldn't hold tight. And every time I did that, another fork or knife found a way to poke into my spine. And when you have to do that while you're climbing mostly uphill, and the straps of your backpack are cutting grooves into your shoulders, and Doug Switek is carrying a pack filled with the bags of marshmallows, you don't get in the best of moods, even if it is a June day off from school. The path heaved in short, quick spurts up through some strands of old birches and then out into more sunlit spaces. We crossed some open rock, and since it had become much warmer, I was glad when the clouds hid the sun and dropped the temperature. Then we climbed into some scrub pines where the wind came on and cooled our backs. Even my pack began to feel a whole lot lighter, and the forks and knives had stopped jabbing into me whenever I hefted it up again. Must be getting stronger like Elia and holes. It was past noon by the time our group got into camp, and I have to say, Mrs. Baker had picked a great spot. Though probably Lieutenant Baker had picked it out years before, an egg-shaped clearing beneath high pines rounded out a bend in a running stream. A waterfall on one side threw its water over mossy stones and into a small, deep pool. On the other side, we set our camp. The ground was not soggy, and there were no mosquitoes and not too many rocks, which I pointed out to Mrs. Baker. Just wait, she said. Mrs. Baker organized the whole site. She gave Doug Switek a camp shovel and had him dig out a fire pit. I lined it with stones from the stream bed. My T and Danny built a teepee fire, and Mrs. Baker put 2 large pots for chili beside it. Mrs. Sidman took everyone else to search for wood, and she organized what was brought back into a pile that slouched from the biggest logs to the smallest twigs. Then Mrs. Baker marked out the sleeping places with long branches. The girls on one side of the fire, the boys on the other, and she and Mrs. Sidman set up a big tent in between while everyone picked spots to lay out their sleeping bags. After the tent was up, Mrs. Baker waved at Danny and me. The chili, she called, and we brought our packs and dropped them beside her. Merrily filled a frying pan with hot dogs and slid it on a grill over the fire. They began to sizzle right away. You had to hand it to Mrs. Baker. For someone who hated camping, she knew exactly what to do. She even had latrines built in the woods, and she posted signs shaped like little hands with gentlemen and gentlewomen written on them, pointing to 2 thin paths that led away from each other. While the hot dogs cooked, I followed the path from the gentleman's sign, down a sharp ridge, over a dry stream bed, up another ridge, and behind a boulder the size of Camillo Junior High. It was peaceful and comfortable. Doug Switek had used his camp shovel to dig a hole in the middle of some bright green vines, and he had set 3 rolls of toilet paper on 3 dead branches of a tree beside the hole. The vines that ran up the trees almost covered them. He left a shovel in the pile of dirt to use as needed. It was the kind of place where you could sit for a while within the vines and watch the green world be green. Then Mrs. Sidman hollered, "Hauling Hood Hood!" You already know what happened, don't you? Let me tell you, it wasn't my fault that Mrs. Baker had given me an old pack, and it wasn't my fault that its seams were starting to split, and when you're hiking up a path that's pretty steep and hefting an old pack onto your shoulders, you don't feel stuff falling out. "You didn't notice it was getting lighter?" said Mrs. Sidman. "Well," I said, "I did notice it wasn't getting any heavier." She held up a spoon. "This is our entire set of utensils," she said. "We can stir the chili," I said. "The can opener was in your pack too," said Mrs. Sidman. Mrs. Baker picked up 4 cans and handed 2 to me. "Come with me, Holling." We went down to the stream bed. "Look for some large stones that are sharp at one end," she said. And that's how we got the cans of chili open. We smashed into them with rocks, which is what I think people did during the westward expansion. At first, the cans just bent over and started to collapse into themselves, but after a few blows, they split open and chili splattered out. By the time Mrs. Baker and I were done, we looked like someone had thrown a whole can over us both. But from the way Mrs. Baker was laughing, you couldn't tell that anything was wrong or that she hated camping. Again, keep noting these things that have changed about Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Sidman was grumbling more than a little by the time we got back, and it didn't help much that she cut up the ends of 3 of her fingers trying to get all the chili out of the battered cans, which were pretty jagged. Every time she cut one, she would glare at me, and I don't think she was thinking thoughts about nurturing one of her students in wisdom and learning. Any lunch after a long hike tastes good, especially if it's on a day off from school. And if you take 2 hot dogs and hold them together, one in each hand, you can scoop up the chili between them and shovel it all up into your mouth. If you lean way over while you do this, most of it won't even drip onto you, which is something that Mrs. Sidman didn't seem to understand. And again, it wasn't my fault that she was wearing her favorite sweater and that streaks of chili don't exactly go with mango, which is a color that you shouldn't wear on a camping trip anyway. She does like mango. I think this is why I was the one who ended up carrying all the pots and pans down to the stream to wash them. Marilee helped. She didn't have to, but she did. So it wasn't bad at all. Scrubbing at the pots together, and her splashing me a little, and me splashing her a little, until we finally gave up and splashed each other all over, so that it looked like we had jumped in, which washed all the chili off me, which is more than I can say for Mrs. Sidman's mango sweater. But by the time we were done, there was a breeze skimming over the top of the stream, and it wasn't warm. We stacked the pots near the rest of the food, and then stood by the fire. Mrs. Sidman did not seem to mind me adding a few sticks to make it blaze up. Still, we were pretty wet, and the problem with getting warm by a fire is that one side of you is always cold, and the other side is always roasting, so you have to keep turning around and around. We were supposed to go swimming in the afternoon, but the breeze that sent me and Marilee to the fire got stronger when a few of the clouds stacked themselves up between us and the sun. And so we played Capture the Flag instead, which our side won because Danny cheated and hit our flag about 3 stories up in a pine tree. And after that, we climbed down past the waterfall and followed a deer track that led out from it, and then climbed back over the waterfall and explored an abandoned stone house in a field beyond it. There were supposed to be rattlesnakes in the basement, but none showed. It was a whole lot colder when we got back, and so Mrs. Sidman sent us to bring in more wood. And while we did, Mrs. Baker heated up pots of hot chocolate, which tastes better in the woods by an open fire than it does anywhere else. And Mrs. Sidman started unpacking the hamburger patties and glaring at me again, since she wasn't sure whether she could cook them with only 1 spoon to turn them over. Anyone would know that she couldn't. And I think that even Mrs. Baker knew it wasn't right to blame me entirely when 4 of Mrs. Sidman's remaining 7 healthy fingers got burns on the ends. Let me tell you, she made a big deal of it. After supper, Marilee and I did the pots again. It was hard to tell when the night came on. We got the fire going pretty high, almost as high as where Danny hid the flag, and the crackling and snapping and small explosions of pine resin sent out sparks that looked like rising stars. The clouds had gotten so thick now that there was no sunset to see, and the breeze had picked up to kind of a steady rhythm, steady enough that not even a single mosquito was brave enough to fly out into it. "Just wait," said Mrs. Baker. But all through the singing that we did that night, no mosquito showed its face, which just goes to show that even Mrs. Baker isn't right all the time. Mrs. Sidman tried some ghost stories after the singing, but there's something about principals that make it impossible for them to tell ghost stories. I mean, you can't spend your days in the main administrative office and then hope to scare someone with a story about a headless ghost. You don't have a chance. She tried to make her voice all low and quavery, but she just got to sound like old Pastor McClellan at St. Andrews, grumbling out a hymn. When she finally got to the end and shouted out the climax, which was supposed to make us all scream in fascinated terror, not much happened. So she sat back down and looked at us like she was going to make us all repeat 7th grade next year. There's a special kind of principal look for that. And even though she had only been a principal for 2 months, she had it down. So when Mrs. Sidman got up to give her what you should be careful about in the woods speech, we didn't pay much attention either. After all, that's what happens when you have teachers and principals along on a camping trip. You hear about all sorts of disasters like mosquito bites, bee stings, what to do if you trip over a stone and get blood on your knee. You're told not to wander so far from camp at night that you can't see the firelight, as if that's going to be a real issue. And you're reminded where the latrines are and how you shouldn't use too much toilet paper since there wasn't a whole lot, and what the shovel is for. Stuff like that. But when she came to the snake part, she got our attention. "There are poisonous snakes all around here," she said. "If they bite you, your leg will swell up until you have ankles like cantaloupes and shins like watermelons. If you get bitten, you have to swallow this very quickly." She held up a small glass vial. "So that you can make it to the hospital. You have to swallow it within 30 seconds for it to work. And even if you get it swallowed in 30 seconds, there's no guarantee. So in addition to this vial, I'll have to cut between the fang marks." She held up a knife that Long John Silver would have been proud of, "and hope that some of the venom will ooze out along with your pus and blood." Jeez. I felt my throat start to close up. Marilee took my hand. Doug Switek moaned. "This is what she should have used for her ghost story," said Danny. "So be careful to check your sleeping bags before you get into them," said Mrs. Sidman. "It might be a good idea to turn them inside out once, just in case. And be sure not to sleep directly under a low branch. Snakes can climb trees, and sometimes they crawl out onto the branches and fall. And you don't want a snake to fall across your face while you're sleeping." By the time she was done, no one was talking, no one was moving, and Doug Switek was close to passing out. "I'm going to stay up all night," said Danny. "We can keep the fire going," said my tea. "I'll help," I said. Marilee squeezed my hand, hard. And that's why, long after midnight, after everyone else had turned their sleeping bags inside out, shaken them, then turned them back and crawled in and zipped them up over their heads, Danny and my tea and Marilee and Doug and I and Mrs. Baker, I guess the part about the snakes got her too, were sitting around the fire as the flames faded and the blue and gold embers glowed like jewels. We sat in close, with blankets over our backs. None of us said anything. We sat beside each other by the fire, silent, watching the jewels change and glow first into white diamonds, then into sapphires, then into rubies. Sometimes Mrs. Baker got up and threw another piece of wood on the fire, and the sparks shattered up into the night darkness, and we watched them ascend until they disappeared like the stuff of dreams. The breeze clicked the branches above us together, and the water farther away tumbled and dropped into the pool below. It was about as far away from the perfect house that you can get and still be in the same universe. The perfect house, always described as a perfect house, but what they're doing right now, as imperfect as it is almost perfect because of it. We probably would have stayed there all night if it hadn't started to rain. And, unfortunately, that's where we're going to stop. Boys and girls, we have one more section, and then our book is over. The two big things to take from this, they're camping, and it's not going well at all, but because of it, it's going great. And Senator Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, just like his brother, John F. Kennedy, was 5 years earlier. All right, we're going to stop there and on to Monday.
To show you goodbye. To show you goodbye.